welcome to the roundtable discussion for the Stream Buffer Study Committee. Said the Chairman Smith and I are glad everybody's in attendance, and I see the fine senator, one of our late coming members, said Senator Henson, said Chairman Smith, could I ask you to open us up with a word of prayer?
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this wonderful day. We ask your blessings upon us as we deliberate and discuss and try and figure out the best policies for the state of Georgia. And in that regard, we also seek your wisdom for making the right decisions as we try and move our state forward. And in this period of Advent, we also want to acknowledge the coming of Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. At this time, I would ask all of our committee members to pull out their copy of Senate Resolution 152. And if you look back to line 57, it says something about a report. And so to speak, this is where the rubber meets the road. And what I hope that everybody has enjoyed the testimony that we've had from a lot of different folks in our state and different experts and kind of where we're at. For me, we've got some different options that we can do here. We can send in minutes of our meeting and call it quits today. Said if that's what you want to do, we'll go ahead and end the meeting right now and do that. But I would ask you that ideally, my goal, and I hope that Chairman Smith and I are tag team enough to where you hope that we can get together and make reach a consensus in order to kind of move this ball forward. You know, we've got a lot of issues that we're dealing with on stream buffers and kind of what it means, but you know, this is a different meeting in that I'm asking all of our members to really participate. And before we've asked a few questions and things, but in this meeting, I'm wanting to see if we can reach a consensus. If there's anything that we see that needs to change in the current statute that we have dealing with the issues, anything that we need to look at from I know Chairman Smith and I have talked, and you know, we got a lot of private property issues, private property rights issues. Said we've got taxing issues that come in, development issues. We've got environmental issues that we look at, and you know, I want to encourage you to be an active participant today. So, and I love to pick on my favorite Senate press. You're actually the no longer interim. But Enos Owens has buttons over there that she pushes sometimes, and I went through this with another study committee. Sometimes she gets to pushing buttons faster than I can. So I'm glad that Enos is here to help push my buttons. So if you would, take a minute and read through from lines 57 through 71. Like all our meetings, we do encourage and we'll be glad to have any member of the public that's here or representing any organization. We have a sign-in sheet up here on the front. If you so choose, we'll have a public comment section at some point during our meeting. I think everybody knows what we're tasked to do. Said and since this is more of an open forum, one of the things I want to commend our hardworking staff that have helped guide us through this process. I think everybody has. Does everybody have this page right here? I think everybody has a sheet that's labeled the potential recommendations, and there's a good disclaimer on the front. It's just some ideas to throw out there to kind of get the discussion started. So what I'm going to do is open the floor to discussion for our members. And yes, sir, Mr. Reed. And if you would, just like always, because we don't know who's watching us on the internet, but they really got nothing to do if they're watching us. But they glad to have them watching. So if you would state your name and
I'm Harold Reheis with Joe Tanner and Associates. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I've given a lot of thought to this since this committee process started, and I'd just like to share my thoughts about how we might bring this study committee to a conclusion. I realize there are other perspectives here than mine, and I'm always glad to hear those. But from the beginning, the Vinson Institute report made it very clear that Georgia already has the most stringent statewide stream buffer law in 9 southeastern states. Some of our neighbor states have nothing, but we have by far the most stringent. So my first thought is we don't need to get more stringent. Second, there's been some discussion about rested vegetation, and I know there are people who didn't like the 2015 state Supreme Court decision in the Grady County Reservoir case, but that was the decision of the state Supreme Court. And my conclusion is we don't need to touch the definition of rested vegetation or where it is applied. That's defined in law, and it has been interpreted by the state Supreme Court. So I think we ought to leave that alone. I think it's important that we acknowledge that we don't have wanton buffer destruction in Georgia. On the contrary, we've got good protection of them, and it is better statewide protection than our southern neighbor states have. And our system here in Georgia works pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's good. And over the years, most people who are involved with this know how to deal with it. Georgia DOT, landowners who want to develop their property, the consultants who serve both of those categories, the developers and DOT, all know, and especially the local issuing authorities and EPD, all know how to make this thing work. And it works. Not perfect, but we're moving forward. Development gets done. DOT is allowed to expand and improve its road system, and it works. And it happens to be better than any of our neighbor states have, and more stringent. We don't need to expand buffer protection to wetlands. Wetlands are abundantly protected by the federal government under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Corps of Engineers has a well-established regulatory program for that. It is difficult to deal with. It's a long, arduous process, and it's expensive, but people know how to deal with it. And the Corps, by the way, changes the rules from time to time. They have different criteria for how much mitigation you've got and what kind you've got to have if you want to disturb wetlands. Our state Supreme Court has declared that you don't have buffers on wetlands. That doesn't apply. The law doesn't mean that. and I believe our state Supreme Court. And if we were to add anything in the way of additional requirements or protections for landowners on wetlands, then that makes it even more difficult for the landowners, for DOT, for growth and development, and it makes us even more stringent than our neighbor states are. Even more stringent than the federal government is. We don't need that. I think that maybe some additional internal examination by EPD would be appropriate to make sure all of its people who go out and determine whether a stream is intermittent or ephemeral do it the same way on the same location. Senator Ginn early on told us about a situation that occurred last year or the year before in his district where you had two EPD people that looked at the same place and they came up with a different answer. And if that happens in EPD, that can certainly happen between EPD and local issuing authorities who have to make those calls too. So if we're going to do anything, a suggestion might be that EPD do a self-examination of the issue of how do you define that line between an ephemeral and an intermittent stream, and make sure internally all the EPD people are doing it the same way, whatever that is, and that they then provide some training, additional training. They've provided a lot of training over the years to local issuing authorities to try to get as much consistency as there possibly can be on that particular thing. And I think that takes care of some of the concerns that Senator Ginn expressed early on here too. But I think with all that being said, we've got a system that works. It's protective. We can be proud of it. And I think we can declare victory and move on without changing the law. I'm done.
Thank you. Former director of EPD, Harold Rehai, said one of the things that for me, and I think, and I was proud to see in the court case where the Supreme Court upheld the definition where you have rested vegetation. To me, there are holes in that system. As you move downstream, said and you come across a point in the stream where there is no rested vegetation, I think that's one of the challenges that we should address or should make some recommendation just in those holes. I like leaving the rested vegetation alone because it works, but for me, the logic of, okay, we've got a stream and a buffer in this area, and you go a little bit further down and you don't have any rested vegetation, and so therefore the buffer totally goes away. That I'm an engineer. I'm not a tree hugger. I'm not but I said, wait, we're protecting it here. How's that logic work? The other side of things is, and just what you alluded to, I've had not just two, but I've had 2 or 3 or 4 EPD folks in the same ditch arguing over, is this an intermittent? Is it ephemeral? What's the definition? And these are professionals that do this every day. I can tell you that one of our committee members, Mr. Monroe, and I were out with Senator Wilkinson, said and some EPD officials in Senator Wilkinson's district, where one of the EPD officials had said, that the property owner had entered into the buffer, said we asked for second opinion, and some more EPD folks came out and they said, no, this is a ephemeral stream. It doesn't carry a buffer and things there. So, it's so difficult for the public to be able to, and there's a guidance document that EPD and the Department of Natural Resources puts out. I think everybody has a copy, but it's a guidance document. It's not as easy to look at and say, yes, this is, no, this is not. So for me, you know, and I love working with Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith, you know, I think if in case you didn't know, her hot button is, and well as mine, what are we doing to the private property ownership and how's that impacting the tax situation, and we're putting restrictions on there. I agree with her 100%. Said we need to make sure that we're addressing that in how we deal with it. The other side of it is I want to try to get to where John Q. Public, and that's who we all work for, is for the 10 million plus citizens of Georgia, so that they can know with reasonable surety, okay, this is what I need to stay away from, and this is okay to do. And to me, that's the challenge of what we've got today. A few holes in the where there's no rested vegetation to address it. I want to deal with the private property issues and kind of what's going on with it, and I want to try to clarify those. And it's always the so-called intermittent or ephemeral. Said and having a distinguishing point between the two, and I'll focus, since I brought Mr. Monroe into the discussion. And I don't know if I might misquote you, Mr. Monroe, but he always asked me, if you don't have a stream, if you don't have flowing water, how do you have a stream? Said so for me, I'm going to pick on Mr. Monroe to try to address a few of those things if I can.
My name's Phil Monroe. I'm a private civil engineering consultant, and as Mr. Reheis stated, the system works pretty well in terms of a general awareness of the public that there is a stream buffer requirement and that it impacts their property. However, in the course of my engineering practice, on numerous occasions, I have had clients who were basically shocked to know that they did not have access to their private property, and that the stream buffer impacted what they were able to do with their property. And it complicates it even further when I present them with a document such as has been distributed to us here in the committee that explains how that they can determine whether or not they actually have a stream on their property. And as Senator Ginn mentioned, if it's a perennial stream, that's very apparent. And if it's just a drainage ditch or ephemeral stream, that's pretty apparent. However, when you get to the point of the intermittent stream, that's where the problems occur. That's where enforcement actions have been taken, stiff penalties levied against my clients. And to me, that's where we need some clarification so that those types of actions don't happen. And so the issue, it really is where the perennial stream interfaces with the intermittent stream. And as Senator Ginn mentioned in our discussions that we've talked about, I think anyone can clearly see if there's flowing water within 48 hours after a rain event, then that's a stream. And I guess the question that I would offer to the committee for discussion is, what aquatic resource is being protected if there's no aquatic environment? And I'll leave that open at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. I'll pick on anybody that wants to touch that one. Said they from our committee or and maybe.
I'd just say is wouldn't emphasize the aquatic.
If you would, let's make sure we get our microphone here.
I wouldn't emphasize the aquatic resources. I'd emphasize downstream and water quality protections. Is the reason for including those.
And you still are Director Rick Dunn from
Oh,
the
I'm sorry.
current
Yeah,
director with EPD.
Yeah. And if I could, I'll just mention, Mr. Chairman, some of my suggestions I sent into Trey and things we should consider. I want to associate my comment, or my support behind Harold's comments on rusted vegetation. I think we believe, or I believe, that any alternatives to rusted vegetation will probably unnecessarily expand the regulatory scope of the act, or provide no additional consistency or clarification in the act's interpretation. I'll also associate my support of your views that there are gaps that rusted vegetation. You know, you have an area of a water body that's protected and over here is not. If there's a careful way to fill in those gaps, that would be something certainly myself and EPD could support as well. We also support anything that would encourage the consistency of interpretation, either among EPD or with the local issuing authorities as well. One new thing I wanted to bring up was at the last meeting, we talked about the possibility or the need to include additional exemptions. And, you know, we talked about the whole variance eligibility categories as well. I sent my email to Trey, and I hope some folks have seen it. If you look at the coastal marshlands protection piece of the Erosion and Sedimentation Act, it's a little different than other general state waters. For example, in the coastal marshlands section, there's a exemption that's not included in the other section that deals with maintenance activities. Carefully defined maintenance activities are exempt from the buffer requirement. So that's something we could look at if we're looking at for additional exemptions as well. There's also provisions in the coastal marshlands rule for variance by rule. Certain activities within the buffer that have a minimal impact on aquatic life or water quality. And it's defined there in the coastal marshlands section. There's a variance by rule process. You still have to follow all the rules, but you submit an application, and again, upon submission, your agreement that you'll follow those rules, the variance is considered to be granted. So to kind of pick up on that conversation at the last meeting, that's something we could look at that's already been studied and thought through on the coastal marshlands section of the ENS Act as well. Encourage the committee, if they're looking in that area, to look at that section of the law as well.
Thank you, Director Dunn.
Yes, I'm Tom Grimes, a builder from the Coweta area. I think I pushed the button. Yes, sir. Along with what Mr. Rehouse has said, the whole plan for the stream buffer is water quality primarily. And it seems that statewide it's 25 feet, which is truly 50 feet on either side. So it's a large volume of area. There seems to be little consideration of what the land is, whether the porosity of the land or the slope of the land, or whether you're in the southern part of the state where it's flat and absorbs water more quickly. And surely no more regulation is desired, but if there's ways for relief from present regulation due to, if you can show that the land is more porous and will absorb the water, then you could get a reduction from the present buffer, or something along that line, so that if you don't want to go through the steps, then you possibly could, it is what it is. But if you can show that this specific tract is acting different than other tracts, then therefore you can reduce it from 25 to 50. In our Atlanta area, this 25-foot buffer is truly a 75-foot buffer because of the regional watershed district, I guess it is. And then in my specific area, if you're on the certain side of a ridge, there's another 75 feet. So you're a 150-foot buffer that becomes a large mass of land. And so if you could show that a basin size was once mentioned, that you could show that it was an area that was under a certain level, then you could get relief from it and lower the buffers, and then it would trickle down to the county. Because I know the county enacts most of these regulations. But if you could encourage them to consider reducing from 100% of the buffer to 10% less, if you can show this, and this, just some sort of way to give options to reduce if it doesn't impact the water quality, because ultimately no one wants to impact the water quality of the state. It's just seems arbitrary at times how these buffers are located. So I don't know if I answered anything. I just threw some more out there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grimes. Said one of the things that for me, and you touched on a point about the size of the watershed. Said and I know we had testimony from some folks with the University of Georgia and what they were doing in the Tennessee area with the size of the basin and kind of determining, okay, how big is your buffer based on the size of the basin, and that's in my mind, I think there's some merit to that. Said it does put it to a more definable, if we can't agree where the ephemeral becomes the intermittent and the intermittent, where's that go? If you do if you had a topo map that said, okay, well, here's how big my drainage basin is, that would be another opportunity to say, okay, in any basin above a certain size, said then, you've got this buffer, below that buffer, the things there. I'm not sure that makes it more or less complicated. My ultimate goal is to make it easy for the 10 million citizens to be able to say, can I do this or am I not doing? What am I supposed to do? And I go back to, hey, when there's flowing water, everybody can agree when they see water and water's flowing. And for me, that's one of the things that kind of drives me into where we go with that. And on an intermittent stream, there are times of the year when it flows, and there's times of the year when it doesn't. Said I'm not sure what the right answer is there, but I'm trying to reach out and see, okay, how do we address that area? Because that's, and I'll ask some of our folks that deal in the enforcement side of things and some of those that have been on that side of it, is that where we see the biggest issue in the misinterpretation of what's going on is where we're in that intermittent stream area? Is that what you see in most of the cases, Director Dunn?
I would agree, but I would just also point out, Google distinguishing between an ephemeral and intermittent stream and see what you find. The science it's very complicated. It's not like there's a simple definition and people just, there's 30 variables you have to look at, for example, in the literature. So it's a very complex topic, but yes, I would agree with your statement. And let me just point out also, in terms of the size of the buffer, again, putting aside the complexity that Senator Ginn mentioned, numerous jurisdictions set the size of the buffer based upon all kinds of variables, such as slope. A steeper slope would require a larger buffer. Flat land would require, so there's options like that available out there that we could certainly look at, rather than the consistent, regardless. So.
Senator Henson.
Just follow up to him. There are different criteria and they're kind of complex, but with training, in most cases, your people should be able to resolve, which is which.
I'll defer to Phil on this one, but I would say the overwhelming majority of cases is fairly clear cut. But we're dealing here with a relatively small pool of close calls.
One of the things, Senator Henson, I will tell you, it is quite disturbing when you go out as a legislator and you have, folks in the department that can't reach a consensus on it. Said and literally it was embarrassing for me to be there when, we've got citizens that are looking to the expertise of EPD, and this was several years ago. This was, I want to say, maybe 2011, 2012, somewhere in maybe that year. Said but if it's that complicated, said that even the pros can't get it, and we see where you can, a lot of engineering companies, they defer to a third party to negate some of that liability on making that determination to a hydrologist that specializes in that arena, and that's not right. It should be a little easier than that for us to come up with that solution.
Yeah, I'll respond to that just in a general way because this specific issue doesn't necessarily apply. But often I'm frustrated too with certain instances that come up. And if somebody came and they were untrained in a certain area, it might be frustrating, but it doesn't necessarily mean the law needs to be changed. Sometimes you go at a different direction. Maybe it was the individual is not worth anything. Maybe somebody needs better training. And even to the conflict, again, rewriting the laws from our perspective isn't always the response to address the frustration we might feel on certain occasion. I'm not saying this is the case, but just a caution there, yeah.
And that's what our goal is today is to, if we see, and it may be a recommendation that we continue more study into how do we come up with okay, we've identified this as a problem, we need to solve it, and maybe, because we're up against a end of the year, our study committee will end on December 31st, that, what is the moving forward, how do we address that? So we've got different options. One of the great news is that Chairman Smith has always advised me, said, we go slow, but we make sure we're covering all the things along the way. So thank you, Chairman Smith. Mike, I think your hand was up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Worley with Georgia Wildlife Federation. A couple of things that I'd like to just point out, and I largely agree with former Director Reheis on some of the comments that he's made here. I think there are some areas, though, that need to be addressed. But let me kind of go back to some of the issues that have been raised here. I think the issue between ephemeral and intermittent streams, and from my perspective, the department has the authority, and I think is the resident expert on this. They've got fantastic folks. I think they can work out those definitions. If there continue to be concerns or questions about that, I suspect that they can that they have the authority already to handle that. From my perspective, this conversation about stream buffers boils down to a couple of pretty simple things. We've got, like one of our regional water commissions, Upper Flint, has recommended that the Georgia General Assembly clarify the regulatory definition of stream buffers to ensure consistent application. I think that addresses exactly what virtually everybody around the table has said here. And if I go back to what Justice Benham said in his Supreme Court decision, OCGA subsection 1276, I won't. It simply does not provide for the establishment of a buffer for state waters that are adjacent to banks without rested vegetation. In order for the buffer requirement to apply to state waters alongside banks without rested vegetation, the legislature would need to take action to amend the statute. So from my perspective, if our Supreme Court is saying we need to provide additional guidance or additional certainty in where those stream buffers lie, I think that probably is a great place for us to start in a recommendation that we ought to make. I see no reason to expand the definition or the reach of stream buffers into wetlands or wherever that we've talked about. I completely agree with Harold on that. See no reason to drive those from my perspective. I think even the exemptions are absolutely appropriate that we've got out there. The exemptions for the agriculture, the exemptions for the forestry. The DOT, utility crossings, those kinds of things, they all seem appropriate to me. I would submit that we ought to really focus on that one question, because clearly the question about what is rested vegetation, where is rested vegetation, and how does that apply to the stream buffer seems to be a consistent question around this table. That's my thoughts on the issue.
Chairman Smith?
I was looking through my file to see, do y'all have copies of the minutes from the previous meetings with you today? I was trying to refer back. I know your comment about Tennessee and how they do their buffers, and I think I remember that they only do their buffers for construction periods and then it goes away. And I'm just trying to remember from that document, we are getting deeper into our conversation here, and we've had some excellent presentations from the past that I think we could refer to that might answer some of our questions. So, but I don't think we have that with us today. I know the recommendations, I think your office summarized those, didn't they? So,
Mr. Bennett said those are proposed by different staff, and it's one of those things that, to me, I think if we can, like I say, I go back to that, fill in the holes on the skips, I guess I'll call them, in the rested vegetation. And I don't know if has anybody got a, how would you like to, because I do think it is prudent for the legislature to fill in the skips on that. That is one of the things the courts have kind of said, okay, well, there's skips. What do you want to do to address that? The other one that I look at is, when Chairman Smith and I was proud to have Commissioner Riley here and talk about a little bit about property taxes. From what I remember, they basically testify all of those things are supposed to go into the process right now, the on taxation of the property, and any restrictions that somebody puts on property that you have, and that should impact the value, and those are things that individual properties, it may be one of those that and there is a process to go through. You have you can appeal to the Board of Assessors. If you don't like that, you can go on to the Board of Equalization. If you don't like that, you can go on to the Superior Court, in a court action there for the property owners on values that are placed on them by individual county tax assessor's office. So I understand, there are a lot of different folks that look at those scenarios and they don't agree, and there's I think a remedy to do that. I'm not sure, and we look at what happens, whether it be the Metro Atlanta Water District or whether it be different jurisdictions in the state, and that's one of the things that I believe, if I see my friend from ACCG out in the audience, said there's some things out there where the state may be an issuing authority, the local government may be an issuing authority, and not everybody knows what the buffer is in their area. I challenge each of y'all to go back to your respective community and ask and see if you can find out what the buffer is in your backyard, because that's another point that as we look, there's a miscommunications on it, and when you start to read those buffers, what you can do and can't do, there's a difference between the state buffer that we set with the 25 on non-trout and 50 foot on trout streams, and what you can do in that area, and then what you can do with the local buffers that's in. I've personally looked at those situations. So I guess for me, I'm wanting to go ahead, Mike. I'll take a break.
Well, I think one of the points you raised is, do we have any suggestions or thoughts? And I think rested vegetation has served us reasonably well for a long time. If we needed some points of further clarification, if you'll do some research, some look at some of these statutes across the state, there are about 30 statutes and 230 recommendations in 30 states that use top of bank as a definition. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right solution, but that is a possibility, and one that is very widely used as we look across the country. So you could either say completely drop the rested vegetation and go with top of bank, or you could say rested vegetation, and in the absence of rested vegetation, top of bank might be an option. We even already use something very similar in the river corridor protection, where there's a 100-foot buffer on certain rivers, and they're measured from the uppermost part of the river banks, usually marked by a break-in slope. So it's it's one that we're in essence, using now. So just a suggestion.
Chairman Smith?
I'm trying to remember the background on how we, as a state, moved to the word rested vegetation. And I think before we went to rested vegetation, top of bank was our definition. So somebody's wisdom way back when decided top of bank didn't work and we need to move to rested. But I don't have any of that information with me.
For all historical knowledge.
I think Bob Hannon remembers a late night substitution on something.
Well, sometimes I have a good memory, but I don't remember us ever using top of bank. I could be totally wrong. So, yeah,
What did we use before rested?
I don't remember. Somebody study every bill that was passed on this thing in the past that had anything to do with it to come up with a complete determination of that. My memory will fail on some of it, I'm sure.
In this discussion, in the past, it has been easier to do a footage as a determination of a buffer. It just seems like that is more easily understood. But when you get more into the weeds with buffers, you're trying to protect water quality and downstream, but it goes to your points about the different topography and what absorbs and what doesn't. And I would prefer variable buffers all over our state, but that's too hard. That's too hard to do. But it would cover. You would have to measure and know. That's the fairest thing I think we could do, but we can't do that. So
We can do whatever you want to.
no, I'm going to tell y'all a story because I think it will help you with this. It's brand new in the legislature. There's a debate over 25-foot and 50-foot for the buffers, trout streams. I didn't know what to do. I was really a freshman legislator. And so the debate went back and forth, and which way did you go, which way did you go? And Speaker Murphy was the Speaker of the House, and he stopped me at a outside a meeting one time and said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. And I said two things. I said, which legislator, which person out in the hallways should I go to? And he said, well, some of those folks are my best friends, but he said they're paid to tell you what they want you to hear. So that was the first answer, my first training. But the second one was the chairman, Ralph Twiggs, a mountain man, plain spoken. And I went to him and asked him because it involved his part of the state. And I asked him about the trout streams, and he was upset that it was even being considered to go to 50 feet. And he had all these maps. I realized later it was a setup. This had all been organized and put in there for my questions and everything. So the Chairman Twiggs pointed to what was a mark on the map of a trout stream. And I looked at it and I said, okay. And he said, look at the elevation. I said, what? He said, look at the elevation. So I did, and I saw that it was a flat bank and very little buildable land, and it went straight up after that. So this person is paying major property taxes on land that we were about to take another 25 feet away from them. And I'm going to use the vernacular here because it is his story. And so he got upset, and he kept telling me, Representative Smith, I'm just a plain mountain man. I said, yes, sir, yes, sir. And he said, look, I don't know how to explain it to you any better. He said, what them folks in Atlanta is trying to call a trout stream, why I can pee a stream bigger than what they're calling a trout stream. So I'm just trying to caution everybody in this room, we're on the right track of what we need to do to change. I'm afraid we don't have enough data yet if we're going to do that change. I think a lot more study. We're going to be seeing too much of each other, but to delve more into the bushes and make sure that we are achieving water quality and we are looking after our downstream neighbors. But at the same time as a state, we're not putting in place policies, even skip policies, that limit the use of a property owner of their land if there is no harm. The rested vegetation came about because it was assumed there was no harm elsewhere. So it works. And that was what our resolution was, to look at the rested vegetation and the private property rights. But wherever we move, it's like a big, huge shift, almost a seismic shift, even with a simple word. And I just want all of y'all to remember Ralph Twiggs, and I want all of y'all to remember that when we make changes, they're going to have unintended consequences. But we do have problems, and we need to get to the bottom of it. I don't know that we have enough time, so that's my concern more than anything, to get there.
Chairman Smith, I want to thank you for sharing that story. I'm glad you could tell it. I couldn't. Said
That's true.
one of the things that, and when you were telling that story, I want to ask you, my committee members said if we could agree on this. You know, when we talk about streams and we have the different types, and you know, those areas that we're talking about with no rested vegetation, said if I go back to, we may have rested vegetation here, we go a little further, there's no rested vegetation, go a little further, there is rested vegetation. And you're trying to look at it from, okay, where do you measure that for the buffer? If you just said where there's no absence of rested vegetation and flowing water, you measure from the water's edge. What would change? What would be the, you know, if you said, okay, from the water's edge, said where would that, give me an example. You know, we have a very diverse state. That's one of the things that, as a redneck from northeast Georgia, said I have to be careful what I look at, because I get down, we've visited several places around the state, and we have such a vast fluctuations in terrain and topography, and soil types and other things. But I'm looking at it from the, okay, absence of if there's flowing water and the absence of rested vegetation, you use the water's edge as your measuring point. Would anybody in the committee say that's a bad thing? Mr. Reheis, I'll call on you.
I think there are places that would work poorly. And I've seen a lot of them. They tend to be below the fall line, where our streams meander a lot. The Satilla River, the Ogeechee River, the Oconee and Okmulgee have a lot of twists and turns in them below the fall line. And on the inside of a turn, you got, or I'm sorry, the outside of a turn, you've got rested vegetation that's pretty obvious. On the inside of a turn, you might have a sandbar that's 50 or 100 feet wide before you hit any vegetation up on the bank. Sooner or later, water is always up, it gets up there during high water, and it'll get over to the point where you can call that rested vegetation. I remember Jack Capp in our first meeting addressed this very thing. If you're on the Oconee River, and you've got one of these sandbars on the inside of the turn, the edge of water would say that your buffer is only 25 feet wide from the edge of the water, and you got another 25 or 125 feet of sandbar before you hit the woods, and none of that has a buffer. So anybody that wants to can come down and build their house right there on that sandbar. It wouldn't be wise, but they could do it. So we would be, especially on the middle-sized and larger streams south of the fall line, I think there'd be a whole lot of folks that would see edge of water as being way less protection than the way EPD operates with their definition of rested vegetation in those circumstances now.
Help me out. because one of the things that, as a legislator, I know we get to make attempts to pass legislation, said, but until the courts rule, said we never know exactly how they interpret what we pass. And the court case that we're talking about, and I'm not a lawyer, so but my understanding of the court case is that they said, hey, if there's no rested vegetation, there's no buffer. Is that not what everybody, do we kind of agree that where there's no rested vegetation, there's no buffer? So for me, I like the rested vegetation. Said and I get your point, what you're talking about. Said I've actually been on the Altamaha River this summer and looked at places like that where you have large sandbars and these kind of things. Today, if I'm following what I think the court ruled, is I could go down there and build my house in that sandbar, and I would not be violating the law because there's no rested vegetation. Said I may call on Mr. Higbee over here, our genius of an attorney, said that gets paid to give us advice. Said or draft legislation, I should say. Said but I think that's one of those areas that, this wouldn't work. As far as where would be advisable, you'd want to recommend somebody not to put a house or to put a house. But right now, the way I interpret the law and the court ruling is they could go build their house on the edge of the water, said as long as they don't get in the water today. Am I missing something, Director Reheis?
I guess I see it somewhat differently. I don't know if you're missing something or not, but I remember what Jack Cap said. If you got one of those big sandbars, there isn't any rested vegetation on that sandbar. It's just all sand. But at some point, you go far enough up and you hit the woods again. All right? And in a normal year, with the winter and spring rains, the river's going to get up and it's going to fill up that whole area that's a sandbar now. It'll be all river. And the rested vegetation is the edge of the woods. So I think that fits within the definition of what the court interpreted. The law doesn't say it has to be the point of rested vegetation when the creek is at its lowest point. It could be rested vegetation when the creek is at some higher flow. And I think that fits within how EPD has written their policy or their guidance on this.
I guess I may pick on Director Dunn or maybe Branch Chief Jack Cap, said to kind of give us some guidance, because what did that impact in the court case? Said and their ruling, what were they trying to address? And I'll pick on Director Dunn. Would you let me pick on one of your staff members? I love to do that. Said Mr. Cap, if you don't mind, come up and grab a seat in the middle. I'll turn your mic on.
That's what I'm here for, Chairman Ginn, so glad to help out. First of all, completely agree with what Mr. Reheis said, that's consistent with EPD's interpretation of the regulation today. Referring back to the court decision, remember the court decision really had to do with specifically that there were wetlands were the issue. And EPD had told the permittee they did not have to get a buffer variance for impacts to wetlands. And the reason we said they didn't have to get a variance for buffer impacts to wetlands, because the wetlands did not have rested vegetation at all. So it wasn't like there was some distance between the bank or the water or whatever to the rest of it. There was just none. I mean, there was a transition from in wetlands. There's a transition from water to land that doesn't involve rested vegetation because of the aquatic vegetation that's in the water, because the water is not flowing. So that was really what the decision was in the court case. It really had to do with wetlands. In regard to the gaps that you are all discussing, EPD acknowledges prior to the decision and then after the decision that there are some places where there is no rested vegetation at all. And so different from the scenario of where you've got a sandbar on the internal side of a bend in a stream, you could have a section of a stream that doesn't have any rested vegetation at all. Those circumstances exist. Difficult for EPD to quantify, to what extent that exists, but certainly we acknowledge that it exists. You've had some comments from the public of some of the riverkeeper groups that have commented that they're concerned that is very extensive. I'm not sure to what degree that we would agree that it's that extensive, but we certainly acknowledge that those exist. And so a couple of the common places where we see it is first in a smaller stream if you've got some sort of significant shading. So you've got the bank itself is significantly shaded. There could be a point at which there's no discernible rested vegetation because vegetation can't grow near that bank because of how extensive the shading is. Another example could be more in South Georgia where you've got a stream that for whatever reason your transition from water to land, there's no vegetation. You're just going to soil. And for whatever reason, there's no vegetation that's growing anywhere near that bank. And in those instances that we would say there's no rested vegetation, and therefore there's no buffer. So, I think that sort of is the issue that y'all are bringing up, that we certainly acknowledge those things exist. As you do discuss that point, one note I would like to add, which is there are examples where there isn't rested vegetation due to some type of shoreline stabilization. That EPD has said, we're not going to have a buffer here because there's shoreline stabilization, therefore there's no rested vegetation. And I do think to bring a buffer into those instances would be problematic because you're going to start regulating activities that have no impact on water quality, and we're just creating bureaucracy for people that have, for example, I showed pictures of the Columbus Riverwalk or the Savannah Riverwalk. We start regulating situations like that, I don't think there's any winners.
Thank you much, Mr. Cap. Said the Director Dunn.
I was going to say, in terms of filling in the gap, one way I've heard discussed is an alternative to rested vegetation. Another way of looking at filling in the gaps is when there is rested vegetation, and maybe there's not across the river on the other bank or further down, maybe we need to fill in the gaps going that way. We have presence of rested vegetation as a precondition, then how far does that extend? Does that make sense? Rather than an alternative to rested vegetation is, if rested vegetation is present, then how far does that go up and down the river? Does it go across the bank where perhaps it's shaded or something like that? So that's another way of looking at filling in the gaps.
I'm always interested in if you have shade from something, how do we, I'm trying to picture this tree that can grow out a half a mile away and the tree's way back here, but the shade covers out, that's a interesting, I can't picture that in my mind. I'm sure it happens, and you maybe show me a picture of that. Yes, sir, Mike.
As a guy who likes to trout fish occasionally, where there are hemlocks growing alongside a stream up in North Georgia, oftentimes those hemlocks will spread out. They'll shelter out vegetation on the surface, so you don't have at a specific point along that stream bank, you don't have plants that are even growing there that can be rested. Is that a fair example?
That's those big old rocks. Chairman Smith.
Thank you. And it's a question for you, Mr. Cap, and it was in your presentation. I found that, so I want to clarify. I think I said top of the banks, but this is buffers measured from the point of rested vegetation, and this is that transition from one definition to our rested vegetation. EPD has measured buffers from the point of rested vegetation for many years. bullet point 1, the ENS Act, Erosion and Sedimentation Act, was amended to incorporate the current rested vegetation language in 1994. Second bullet point, formerly the statute had provided that the buffer was measured from the stream banks, not the top of the banks, but the stream banks. And then the third bullet point was rested vegetation means movement of water that removes soil, debris, and vegetation, creating a clear demarcation between water flow and vegetative growth. So that was the change in 1994, and I think it was a 40th day offered amendment late in the day. So,
Well, I should have remembered that because I was director back then.
were you really?
It just shows you.
But I don't know if that helps us or not with our discussion. So for some reason, we moved away from stream bank to rested vegetation, and I'm not sure why.
Yes, sir, Mr.
I think in reality, when you do rested vegetation out in the field, it sounds good, but, it gets games played all the time. I mean, by people like me. I mean, I get paid to play these games, for goodness sake. And even that EPD will play a game the other way sometimes. They'll claim buffers on streams that the Corps didn't even claim jurisdiction on at a federal level. It's those kind of inconsistencies and a lot of how the LIAs are implementing their work. That's what gets people upset. More people have yelled at me about state waters than anything I've done with wetlands. And it's because I can't tell them up front what to expect. So it's kind of like this implementation problem to me. Rested vegetation, just for talking about it, if you do top of bank, most of the time you're going to be expanding the buffer, because usually rested vegetation is below top of bank, more waterward. So in case we wanted to look at top of bank, we might actually be increasing the buffer in that case.
I think Harold Reheis was voting to not increase the, I'm not sure if I got that right, Harold. Did I get that right? Yeah, thank you. Right now, and I'll ask from an enforcement side for EPD, those areas where you don't have rested vegetation, have we got any problems in people doing things that you feel are harming the environment?
So I'm going to defer in front of my boss, which is a difficult position to be in, but we don't do the enforcement in my branch.
It's at the district offices. Jack's deferring.
Okay, and so I'll ask you, Director Dunn.
That's a very difficult question. I would say,
Is it?
I'm going to kind of punt on that and say we do our best to enforce the law as written. The law does not require a buffer where there's no rested vegetation. Now, your question
For
is,
clarification standpoint, I'm looking at if we don't address any of this where there's no rested vegetation, have we turned our back on any kind of environmental issue that we really need to solve? That's something that you feel like, oh gosh, this committee really needs to address that.
and I think Jack can expand on this, but I think where there's an issue are gaps where you have rested vegetation here. You go a little further down, no rested vegetation. One segment has a buffer. Just further down there, but for whatever reason, there's no rested vegetation, no buffer there. That's probably the problematic area from our perspective.
And currently, under the way that your field folks look at that, said have we got any significant environmental issues that have come apart as a part of that that we're not addressing? Is the real crux of it for me. If it ain't broke, I don't want to fix it. I think that's one of the things that I've heard before on this committee. If it's not a problem, then we don't need to address it.
I would say if a segment of the waterway is worthy of protection here, it probably should be worthy of protection 10 feet down the river.
And I'll go back to then. Is there a recommendation from the committee on verbiage that we could recommend to the legislature to kind of cover that gap? I think Mike had his hand up first. So.
I actually think we had testimony at I believe it was the last meeting from a landowner in Douglas County that had an issue where he didn't have rested vegetation. I believe that's the case. I'd have to go back and look, but I think Director Dunn just did a terrific job of pointing out one of the sort of the challenge that I see and the challenge that I think we're discussing here around the table. I think there are several different options that we could use. I would even would suggest, I mean, he's absolutely correct. Where there's rested vegetation, use that as your standard. To connect the dots, there are other ways. You might use ordinary high water mark. You might use top of bank. You can use a debris line. There are a lot of different ways that you could, at that point, begin to, that would not significantly expand. Because I have no reason for us to want to expand buffers in this discussion. But there are quite a few different ways that you can connect the dots, if you will, along a streamline. I'm glad to submit some language if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Director Reheis.
Former Director Reheis.
Former Director Reheis. Well, it's kind of like president. Once you're president, you're always president. And
I used to be somebody, but now I'm just a guy. Your question was, do we have any recommendations to make to the legislature for changes?
That's really what the emphasis of our committee is it, you know, we've looked at it.
Yeah.
We take an expert.
I would hate to see us make from this committee meeting, a recommendation for language like top of bank or normal high water mark. I think is an opportunity to create unintended consequences. I don't know how hard it would be to determine what normal high water mark is on any stream. I would think that would be a much more difficult and rigorous process and open more to challenge than rested vegetation by a long shot, with all due respect, sir. We don't need to bring more conflict and arguments into this process than we already have. So I wouldn't want to recommend any changes to the General Assembly based on what this committee has done, what this committee has heard so far. I think finding that we've got a pretty solid law and a pretty good working process now, even though imperfect and certainly can always be improved, is something that we can recommend to the General Assembly, along with some things that Director Dunn has said that he's willing to look at. How do we fill in those gaps where they exist? How do we improve our internal policy or definition of how one discerns where an ephemeral stream stops and where an intermittent stream starts, so that EPD people look at the same place and come to the same conclusion, and then can provide that training. I think those are recommendations that are solid, but they aren't about legislation. I think we need to let EPD work on this and chew on it and come back with their findings before any legislation is changed. That would be my recommendation for this committee to conclude.
Thank you. Former Director Reheis. Mr. Monroe.
Since this is a study committee, and a couple of proposed definitions that I would throw out if we were going to throw this back to EPD for further clarification about how to define what's a stream or where we measure a stream buffer from. I would propose that a stream would begin at the point of intersection of the seasonal high water table and the low point within a water conveyance channel. and then it would continue down gradient until it reaches an ocean. And there would be a buffer on the stream from the point of beginning of that stream throughout its entire flow to the ocean. There are very well accepted practices for determining seasonal high water table. It's done every day in determining where to place septic systems, and there's clear delineation in the hydric soils associated with a seasonal high water table. And seasonal high water table. Pardon?
Table is groundwater, right?
Is groundwater.
Yeah.
Which is the base flow that feeds the stream. So at the point where that seasonal high water table meets the low point in a water conveyance channel or a ditch, it doesn't have to be raining. It doesn't have to be during the summer growing season to look at plant life. You can look at the modeling, the chroma 2 modeling in the soil, and that's a clear sign of where over the centuries the seasonal high water table through reduction oxidation process has changed the physical characteristics of the soil to delineate where that base water flow is. That'd be a way to define exactly where the point of beginning of any intermittent stream is.
Seasonal high water table, it's typically like your intermittent stream head, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so you're basically saying perennial and intermittent streams.
Well, a perennial stream will always have,
It's
always have
intercepted the
flow.
water table permanently.
but you can move up gradient from
Yeah.
a perennial stream, and there's a point where you're going to have seasonal high water table indications by the hydric soil of where that over the centuries, because it changes the characteristics of the soil. So that's a very good indicator. It's widely accepted. It's used to determine where all septic system drain fields are placed. I've done hundreds of soil surveys, and that's one of the primary characteristics that we're looking for in terms of determining where that seasonal high water table is. I would also offer that a stream buffer would be measured from the point on a stream bank that is sufficient to convey the blank year storm event. And you can decide if that's the 5-year storm event, the 10, the 15, the 50, the 100. I don't know what that would be, but there again, that's another very quantifiable data point that you can find on every site. And it would address Mr. Crime's concerns, because when you delineate the drainage basin at any point on that stream, you're taking into it and you're determining what the 25-year storm event is going to be. You're taking into account all of the runoff characteristics associated with that drainage basin. What percentage is it of forested? What percentage is impervious? What percent grass and whatever? That gives you a flow rate that can be transmitted at that point. And it's just a simple matter of looking at the cross-section of the stream at that point, finding out what the flow area is, and then from that you can determine exactly where those points of that stream for that rain event is. And it could be documented, defined, defensible in court. Everybody would understand exactly where the stream buffer is being measured from. Just something to consider.
I got to ask a question on that one myself. Said they, you know, I spent 10 years as a county manager, and when you get out there and they you have a rainfall event, and you know, just because it's a 100-year event, a lot of people think it happens only once every 100 years. You could have 3 of them in a month, said they, if you really look at it. But statistically, it's the once every 100 years. But you get I know in northeast Georgia, we'll see where a stream bank will overflow the bank and flood into some area in there. And one of the things that for me, if you would address kind of how that definition of a stream buffer in that area that gets flooded in if we picked a 100-year event and I watched that water cover a 50-acre, 100-acre field, said what does that mean for the stream buffer?
Well, currently, the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual addresses that, and it defines overbank flood protection that has to be dealt with in terms of stormwater management from a developed site. And that's a 25-year and less frequent storm events. And those are considered overbank flood conditions. So they're not, and because of the frequency of those events, they're not as frequent. So if we're looking at what would be considered typically top of bank, and in my estimation, that would be the 25-year storm event, as defined by the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual.
Mike?
Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that recommendation. I have no idea what you said. I think that's one of my challenges. I think that, in essence, you're sort of pulling in you're going to have to hire an engineer to go out and do an assessment at every site on soil analysis and all those kind of things. That seems a large burden to put upon a landowner or our regulatory folks. My suggestion still would go back, and I think Mr. Cap said something earlier that I'd like to just go along with. He did say that the Supreme Court case was in response to a wetlands issue, but the ruling specifically addressed state waters, not just wetlands, and that's what our Supreme Court said needed to be addressed, is state waters and buffers associated with that. So, I mean, that would be that's just maybe I'm reading it differently, but that's the way I saw it. But what I would suggest is that we address that specific issue. I would suggest perhaps even that we say the study committee recommends that we address that specific component of rested vegetation and connecting the dots, as Director Dunn said, and allow EPD to help us make some recommendations on what language is most appropriate and most easily definable and enforceable, and come back and make that recommendation to you as the chairs of the committee if we wanted to move forward with some legislation. But clearly, the Supreme Court said we need legislation to address this issue.
I would clarify the dissent said that. One
Okay.
dissenter said that, but the majority opinion, I don't believe. They said it was pretty clear. The dissent said there was some ambiguity. So I don't have the decision in front of me, but
I'm going to call on my legislative colleague, Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Scott Holcomb, and I've been listening because this is not my area of expertise whatsoever. But a couple things that jump out. One, the Supreme Court case was 2015, so it's been 3 years since the court said, legislature, if you're going to take action on this, you should do it. And the specific lines in the case that I think are pertinent are, it refers to the statute and it says it simply does not provide for the establishment of a buffer for state waters that are adjacent to banks without rested vegetation. In order for the buffer requirement to apply to state waters alongside banks without rested vegetation, the legislature would need to take action to amend the statute. So 3 years have passed since the court said this. So I don't know exactly what the exact terminology should be, but it seems to me that having something that has both a component of rested vegetation and then top of bank or ordinary high water mark, or to give some clarity to landowners, to builders, to everybody. And I really like the idea of giving some variables, but the challenge there is how would you be able to make that work, and that would put an additional burden on either the state or the county to have individuals to review those applications of exceptions. But I think the idea makes total sense. So my recommendation would be supportive of some legislation that has alternatives for those areas where there is no rested vegetation, because I think we all see that that is a gap in the current law that exists, and to exclude the shoreline stabilization area that you talked about too, like that could be put into the code, and I assume that would be pretty easy to define as well. So those are my thoughts, Mr. Chairman.
I may have not followed all of it, but as I'm thinking, did I hear you say that we want to ask EPD to make a recommendation back to us, the on gaps in those areas where there is no rested vegetation, that we'd like to get the clarify for me in a.
Mr. Chairman, what I offered out were the terms that I've heard, and I don't know if these are terms of art or more than that, are top of bank, ordinary high water mark, as being possible alternatives for how you define the areas without rested vegetation. But certainly, if the agency has expertise in terms of coming up with some phrasing, then certainly I would guess other committee members would be open to that suggestion for those areas where there is no rested vegetation, which is the current gap in the law.
And I just want to remind all our committee members that, this committee will adjourn at the end of the year. We can make that as a recommendation to have EPD to come back to the legislature, or, we recommend that there be another study committee to further pursue this. That we've got different options. For me,
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chairman?
by all means.
For the director, would you feel comfortable giving the legislature that? Because that's sort of a policy thing, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely, but I would ask, to me, we need some clarification. I think the way I'm looking at gaps is we have waterways with rested vegetation as a precondition, then determining, all right, there's gaps in that waterway, how should we fill in those gaps? Another viewpoint I've heard here, I think I'm hearing here, is with waterways with no rested vegetation, how do we provide buffers? And those are two different things. I mean, does that make sense? And I think from my interpretation, the way we're approaching filling in the gaps is we have a waterway with rested vegetation, and there's portions of the waterway that do not have rested vegetation. How can we fill in those gaps? That's one way. The other way is you have some waterways with no rested vegetation whatsoever. And is that a gap? So there's two ways of looking at the
that
gap.
area that you're talking about with no rested vegetation at all, that's typically a marshland.
It could be a lot of things, but the way we've always approached that, of course, is there's no buffer whatsoever. And I think where there's ambiguity, which we're getting to our conversation before, you have a waterway with fits and starts of resident vegetation.
Well, I for one, where y'all have interpreted, you don't have any. That marsh property said I kind of like that. I agree that, that skipping down the stream, the continuity is okay. We protected it here, but because there's a gap.
That's what we see as problematic.
And that's where, to me, if I'm understanding right, said you'd like EPD to come back with a recommendation, whether it be to the legislature or we continue a study committee at some other point, to say, okay, we want to try to address those gaps. Am I oversimplifying your comment?
I'm open to that, or I'm open to, if the committee thinks that we can come up with a definition, then to try to explore that as well, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Henson.
And just ask Commissioner, I would have thought that, the intent for rested development in that hole that was created by the court decision would be something you've considered, and that you might have something, because you understand the will legislature was for the rest of development to be used, something consistent with that. What would be the most consistent definition that you presently have to fill in those holes that Scott mentioned, not talking about the marshlands with, areas that never have, that?
Well, I mean, and Jack's much more familiar with the case than I am, but the issue of the case was, do all state waters have a buffer? And that was the issue the court was addressing, and the answer was no. Only those state waters with rested vegetation.
Yeah, and those that have rested vegetation, but find, as Chairman Ginn said, some holes because of shade, soil conditions, and other reasons, what would be a consistent definition that I'm sure you've considered to fill in those holes?
I can't provide you with a definition, Senator, today of language that would fill in those holes adequately, but that's something we can certainly study.
I always want my chairman to chime in.
So, I think it's a great conversation. What worries me is that this is still existing in the viewpoint of many as a problem in the 3-year period. But what I'm really looking at is the calendar between now and the end of December. And I don't know that our committee could meet again. I have conflicts most of that time between now and the end of December. So, first of all, let's just find out if we can meet again. How many can?
One of the things, and my goal today was whatever recommendations, if we can get to a consensus on recommendations, that we write up that report, and then I think we're allowed, if I'll ask our great staff, I think we could approve that write-up as a teleconference call, said they, and do that. Said they, to me, I did want to have, and that was one of the things I see happen where, till it's down in black and white, you want to make sure that everybody's agreeing on the same exact language. So for me, my goal was to if we're going to make a recommendation today, and if we have those recommendations, we when we leave from here, we have staff to write it up, just disperse it to all our committee members, and we ask our committee members to do a teleconference versus coming in. Now, I know that Chairman Smith has a lot of things going on her plate. I know this is a tough time of year for all of us. I did not see. Did you have a comment?
Just that the chairman would have to be here. Everyone else can be on
Right.
the conference call.
And so to me, I'm looking at it from a perspective of, if we did that, I'll be open to what's the wishes of the committee. Said I know that's very tough for Chairman Smith and myself. So, but we want to try to make sure that all of the work that we're putting in, we'd like to get to a point where we can feel comfortable. And it may be that we put some monkey back on EPD to help us with that in the future. And that's one of the things that. This is, as Chairman Smith says, we always want to try to make sure we go slow, and I think y'all have heard, we don't want the unintended consequences, because when we make a recommendation, if that gets implemented into the law and the courts take a different interpretation, you can find a lot of things that you wouldn't expect.
Mr. Chairman, since I missed all the other committees, I'm available. I'll make it up. So I'll make myself available.
I can't.
Is it appropriate to make a motion?
We'll entertain it. So we'll listen. We may not get a second, but we'll at least listen.
Okay. Good. Well, I'd be willing to move that the committee recommend the Legislative Council in concert with EPD develop language to address the gap issue as discussed by Director Dunn. And submit that to our legislative members of the committee for possible consideration in the upcoming legislative session.
Is there a second on that motion?
I'll second, but I want to clarify a little bit now. So his recommendation is that we as a committee ask for the EPD to come up with a standard to fill those intermittent holes, and make that recommendation after we adjourn, after the first of the year, to the committee, and I'll add to that, all members of the House and Senate Natural Resources.
Well, the committee no longer exists.
This committee will disperse December
All-
31st.
all
But it would be the
members,
Natural
former-
Resources and Environment Committee in both
Yeah.
chambers.
That would be good enough. But I mean, former members of this committee, I think, would be interested, so although the committee no longer exists, all former members of this committee.
I have to see how many gaps
Do you have a
exist.
deadline?
between-
I always, until the planet ends, said is my deadline. I always like to pick on our staff. Mr. Bennett, did you feel comfortable enough? You got the verbiage of the, what?
I think so. He's moving that EPD work with legislative council or just,
To develop language.
okay, work with legislative council to develop language addressing the intermittent gap issue and submit to the members sitting on this committee.
That was my initial one, but I'm fine with going with the.
Mike, if I might interject, legislative council is there for the legislators.
Yeah,
Said
not-
so it might be more appropriate that EPD make a recommendation back to, the two committees, said for them to take action at a future date, said on addressing that with legislative
Perfectly
council.
comfortable with that.
If
Can
that's,
I raise another option, is EPD submit to the chairs potential options and pros and cons, rather than legislative language?
Comfortable with that.
Basically, one of the, we let off with saying we didn't want to increase regulation or buffers, and that's the only thing we were gonna have accomplished if we'd done this. We have created buffers where they are not.
well, if we'll get to the next one that I want to do, we'll fix some of that.
Because I agree, your original comment, once the stream is buffered, it should continue all the way to the ocean. It was something you had said to me personally earlier. And so we're trying to figure a starting point of where to measure from, rather than the outside edge of it. Is what basically we're trying to determine through your.
Where those gaps exist in the rested vegetation as you move downstream
Yeah.
is really the hole that we're asking EPD to help us with some language that might work in future legislative sessions. Said now for me, I'm going to tell you, said I don't mind saying, said I'm the guy that says if there ain't no water, there ain't no stream. Said and I know that when my chairman put it so eloquently as one of our North Georgia members put it, said I can tell when there's water flowing and when there's not. And to me, I'm trying to clarify it for the 10 million citizens of the state that, okay, how do we give them a better delineation? I know that not everybody went to that trade school down on North Avenue, like my friend Phil Monroe said would put it so eloquently as he did with the storm events and the high water marks and those things. Said, but I want to make it easy for the public to understand, hey, this is what I can do and this is what I should not do. So I don't know if there's any support for that on the committee or not. So I'll ask if I know that would make a big, all of those intermittent streams that we look at would have a buffer, said for portions of the year, said and you want to use best management practices and things, outside of that, if there was there's no flow in water, said we'd want to make sure that we're protecting our resources, but I can tell you that in an ephemeral stream, AKA a ditch, that if you go in and disturb a ditch and it rains, that's going to go downstream if you don't use best management practices. So, former Director Rehai said.
What I hear in this motion is that Mike is asking that we make recommendations that are going to go to the General Assembly for consideration in this upcoming session. And I think that would be a mistake. This is so complex. This affects a lot of people, a lot of property owners, a lot of streams. I think that Mr. Monroe made some intriguing suggestions here that might work, but they ought to be considered carefully, and it takes time to do that. And if we try to do that between now and the 2018 legislative session or during the session, we're going to screw up something. I guarantee you. I've seen it happen time and again. There are going to be unanticipated things that'll happen as a result of any language we do, and unintended consequences are going to come on. We don't need that to happen.
If I might,
If we take our time, let EPD work with the suggestions of the committee, look carefully at Mr. Monroe's proposed definitions of where ephemeral ends and intermittent starts and so on, then I'm satisfied that we'll come up with a better set of recommendations for changes if changes are needed. If we can't come up with something better than what we got, we don't need to be making changes. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to support Mike's motion. I just wanted to let the committee know that, but I don't want this committee to think that we're messing up if the legislature has not acted now 3 years after the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court didn't say the legislature needs to act. I'm going to read from their decision. By adding the phrase "as measured horizontally from the point where vegetation has been rested," the General Assembly expressly defined how the buffer is established. Since the legislature offered no other method for the buffer to be established but for measuring it horizontally from the point of rested vegetation, the buffer necessarily cannot be applied to state waters that are adjacent to banks without rested vegetation. No further interpretation or analysis is required. That doesn't say the General Assembly needs to fix this. They just said what the General Assembly did means this, and that's the end of it.
if I might, said Mr. Rice, one of the things that I didn't hear in Mike, he put a timetable in it, said I said future legislative sessions. One of the things that I hope you didn't interpret that, this had to be done in the 2018 session. I know I would agree with you that would be one of those things. Be tough for EPD to get all that to us in a timely manner, and I agree with you that the knee-jerk reaction is not always the best one, as my Chairman Smith has told me on numerous occasions that we proceed slowly. So
I read 2018 into what Mike said, and I may have been wrong there.
Just for clarification, or just to point out, the decision's 3 years old. We've had at least one piece of legislation introduced in the General Assembly. Our department has already said we have an issue with those gaps and would like some clarification with those gaps. I'm not suggesting that we solve every issue associated with stream buffers, intermittent versus ephemeral, those kinds of things. Certainly not suggesting any expansion of any reach of buffers, not suggesting any change to any exemptions or anything along those lines. I'm really suggesting that we do take a look, because I'm also looking at the Supreme Court decision, and further they do say if we want, in essence, to address those gaps.
Well, can I clarify, Mike?
Sure.
So, in my reading, the Supreme Court, the dissent talked about the gaps between some state waters are protected, some are not. That's not the gap I'm talking about.
Okay.
I try to make it clear there's two different, multiple gaps here, but the dissent, the Supreme Court case, the Tire Creek case was talking about a gap between some state waters have
And
buffer
others.
protections, some do not. That's one gap. The gap I'm talking about is when you have a waterway with rested vegetation and the gap's there.
I completely agree with you, and I would,
Okay, okay.
and I think that that's
Okay.
really the area that I think we should address. And it's not that I'm saying we don't need to move forward, but at what point have you looked at it long enough? I mean, particularly on some of these, this one seems a fairly cut and dry question.
I'm going to suggest our committee take a 10-minute recess. Said when we come back from that recess, we'll see if there's any public comments that want to be made, and then we'll try to see where we go. That motion that you made is pending. Said till we come back from recess. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your indulgence. Said neither me nor Chairman Smith were very good timekeepers. Said I think that was 10 minutes, wasn't it?
Georgia time.
Said currently we've had some discussion, and during our intermission we had a little more discussion. I think that right now the posture we're in is we have a motion out there, and it was seconded, but I'm gonna ask that because I know Chairman Smith, and that's one of the good things about being co-chairs and chairman on the committee is we get to do a lot of latitude in what we say. So at this point, I'll ask for a motion to table on that.
I think you wanted to change it if you want to listen to this.
Well, I want to put it aside for a little while. We may bring it back up or ask for another motion later on, but let's
Well, motion to table takes no debate.
that's correct. So
But you and I can't do any of that.
that's right. But I'll ask our committee. The all in favor of table, please raise your right hand. Any opposed? Yeah, you got 2 or 3 that are opposed. So motion carries. And that motion is tabled. We may bring it back up, but in reference to my esteemed colleague and chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, said I'll call on Chairman Smith.
First of all, I appreciate everybody's service on the committee. And if you're not familiar with the legislature, you're experiencing a little bit of what it's like to serve in the legislature and how you try and find the right answers. And a lot of times our time factor is the 40th day as we try and solve a problem. There is not an issue that's been brought up today that I don't want to know more about and want to find a way to find a solution. I don't think we have sufficient time frame in which to do that, but I don't think we should let this body of work and these questions go just disappear. I think to me it's a continuation and a process. How it works is your General Assembly and all your legislators are free to introduce any legislation they want to during the session. That's what we're elected to do. So I'm putting some considerations out there for y'all. If you share that all these different issues that have been brought up are important and that they need further debate, we don't have to take any action at all with this committee. It doesn't mean we failed as a committee. It just means that we are identifying things and we still think we need more information. So I cannot make a motion or anything, but I can, I guess in my capacity as chair, is suggest that the committee wishes to have a recommendation to the General Assembly. It could be that this requires further study. And then it's up to the will of the body as to how it proceeds. But the action of this committee is that it's important and it needs further study. And that can be your recommendation as a committee, or we can take no action at all and submit the minutes. But if you feel that we've already punched our time clock a few times and want this recognized, that would be a way to do that. It is just putting this information out there for you. I don't know if I've left any of the points out, but I want to thank everybody for their interest and willingness to discuss this very complex body of water.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Said Senator Henson.
I appreciate that, and I understand it is a complex issue, and as somebody else said, I didn't even understand all that, but it's very clear that you have a lot of knowledge and scientific ability on this. And I think the member to my left was going to substitute this motion because felt there probably wasn't a comfort level at this time, but what me and him had talked is possibly having the and I will do this as individual member of the legislature, member of natural resources if we don't do it as committee. But I think 3 years, is about gone by. This court case was 15, 2.5. The EP director I briefly talked to, he's got a staff who's considering these issues and have not addressed it. But it's reasonable to ask him as an individual legislator or everybody on the committee, and I think this committee should do it, ask him to come up with certain policy recommendations, not one, but, different options to address the intermittent nature along streams that the legislature could consider. So I would like to make a motion that the EP director come up with recommendations to address the identified gap and submit those recommendations in writing to the chairs of this committee. And then hopefully I would get that from you, Senator Ginn, and the Representative Holcomb get it from the chair. Just recommendations that we as policymakers then could consider, center of the stream, bank, something to try to make sure there was conformity in these areas that there are gaps. And, like I say, it's up to us as policymakers to later identify which one is the best one. But I think as a committee, we should at least ask him to provide you guys with some recommendations.
For clarification, I believe you wanted to, not this committee, but the House and Senate Natural Resources Committee, if I am hearing your motion correctly.
I believe you are both chairs, so I'd be
Yes,
happy
yeah,
to make sure
I
the
just-
chairs of those two committees get
Right, so-
recommendations that you
Because
hopefully would.
this committee disbands December 31st, but.
I understand.
So we're on the same page. So, having heard your motion, I want to clarify with our staff that they've got it written, or maybe you've got it written out, you could share with the staff so we can get it exactly how you.
Yeah, I think you understand. It was
Okay,
simple.
and I'll ask for any second on that motion.
Senator Henson, would you read that or state your
Yeah,
motion one more
that the
time,
EP
please?
director, the EPD director to come up, does that come up?
Develop.
Oh, develop recommendations to address this identified gap. We're referring to the ones not separate waters or something, but where there is rested and then not rested and rest. Identified gap, and submit these recommendations in writing to the chairs of this committee, but I'll change that to the chairs of the House and Senate Natural Resources Committee. And, I won't say, I would expect that to be in January, but I won't set that in a motion. That's fine.
Second.
There's a motion and a second, for discussion, I'll open the floor for discussion, or any further discussion on it. And one of the things that for me, I would suggest that we ask and we'll leave that at the discretion of EPD, but for me, I kind of tend to think that it may take much longer than this upcoming legislative session for him to make that report to the chairs. And we'll leave that discretion to EPD if that's okay with you. We don't spell
I'll go
that
by
out.
his office and ask him, but I don't have a time certain in there. I would recommend, that to this committee that it shouldn't be that long. And again, this is not one recommendation. This is, different policy decisions that you all could address as your chairs and as members of the legislature. And I'll be checking with you to see if you got it, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like you to share it with me, and I'll be checking with the director too on these options as an individual member.
Any further discussion, Mr. Monroe?
Would the recommendations generated by the EPD director also address identification of intermittent streams and simplification of that process, as well as property rights and values associated with stream buffers?
No, that's not part of this motion. This motion is mainly trying to address, what was related in the court case about addressing these intermittent areas where there was no rested vegetation along streams, and certainly not meaning those.
I'll be happy to entertain that motion in a subsequent, motion of the committee said if we don't want to add it to this one, for me, want to know, is there any further discussion? My goal is that, the legislators in here know how difficult it is to reach consensus. Said I will ask for a show of hands in favor of that motion. at this time, so we're calling for a vote. All in favor, please signify by raising your right hand. Have 3 supporting. All opposed, please signify by raising your right hand. Have 5 opposed, the motion fails. So you see, it is a difficult thing that we do at the Capitol every time we get together. So yes, sir.
As you suggested, there's so much more that needs to be learned through this prior to beginning to think about legislation, much less even just wording. Rather than just send in notes, and I would like the committee to at least be acknowledged that we've listened to lots of good information. We've determined that there's much more that needs to be done. I don't think it'll be done quickly, and I think it needs to be done in a committee such as this in the future, because I don't think it'll occur in the next 8 days. If there's a way to make a motion that we, as you were more eloquent and as you suggested earlier.
I think what you're saying is that you're making a motion to recommend, your
More
recommendation
study.
is that the issues are very serious, they need further study, and your recommendation is that the General Assembly consider further study on the issue.
Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I said.
I have no idea why, so someone.
I'll ask Trey, did you get that motion?
Could you repeat it one more time?
No.
Let's, you want to write it, you want to write it out, said or help Trey write it out?
Surely. Primarily, the issue needs further discussion and should be continued in the future.
You recommend to the General Assembly that the issues are worthy of further discussion and study.
He used term future study.
Yeah,
I'm fine with future study, as long as we're
Future
not
study.
recommending another study committee or anything else. I
just
think
just
you know,
future study.
Which could be next week or the week after. I mean, we need to address the issue as soon as possible. We may differ on how complex and how long that study needs to be.
Right.
As far as just referring to future study, I'm good with that, but as far as saying, that we need to punt it to a 2019 session, I'm not in agreement with that.
I'd be a little more comfortable if your motion said several issues need further study.
Yes.
True.
Saying the issue kind of might make some people think there's just one issue.
Well, how about
We've talked about a lot of
define the issues that we need to study more. The gap issue was something that was really only brought to light in this meeting today, the importance of that. The size of the buffers are things that ought to be discussed in greater detail, and the limits of that. So,
the issue of intermittent versus ephemeral.
yeah, so maybe we define that in my motion.
Private property rights.
Probably. The 3 items that were listed as suggestions are primarily the 3 items that this buffer committee was to focus on.
One of the great things about having good staff is he's listening, and I'm hoping he's able to write that down. And when he gets it to the point where he thinks he's got it, I'm going to ask him to read it to us, and then we may tweak it a little bit more.
But it's still an active motion from you.
Yes.
And we'll give him a few minutes, and you might want to. What do you need, Trey?
What I have so far is that we're recommending that the issues that we've brought forward by this study committee are worthy of future study. Those issues being the gaps, the intermittent versus ephemeral stream issue, and then what was the third one?
Size of buffer and private property rights. Sizes of buffer. We did marsh.
Size of buffer, private property rights, and then marshlands, or
I would.
That's not you, is it?
No, I'm not sure what that means.
I wouldn't put wetlands in there.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you have three issues that you're dealing with.
So gap,
The,
size of the buffer, intermittent versus ephemeral, and private property rights. So
well,
it's four.
isn't the size of the buffer dealing with private property rights? Isn't that what that's about?
I think it goes back to the slope, soil properties and things like that, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So what's the
Size
word?
of buffer doesn't necessarily
Do anything.
include private property rights. If y'all want to put private property rights in,
Okay.
it's okay, but,
So both would work. Both better describe it.
Two separate issues.
Two separate issues. So gap, size of buffer, intermittent versus ephemeral streams, and private property rights.
I've got that.
Okay.
Will you want to?
Sure. So the motion
Tell,
would be
tell Tom what he said.
that Mr. Crimes has recommended that we've selected 4 primary issues that are worthy of future study, those being gaps in stream buffers, intermittent versus ephemeral streams, the size of buffers, and private property rights.
And that'll be studied at a later time.
Yes, sir.
So,
By the legislature?
Just recommend it to the legislature that it needs further study.
Yes.
We can then at that point in time do study committees or do ad hoc committees or do whatever we need to, so.
Okay.
I second that motion.
Now you have to repeat it,
there's a motion made and seconded, said are there any further discussion on the motion?
I just mentioned, I mean, we'd be remiss as legislators not to continually looking at all these issues and studying whether or not we have direction from this committee or not. I mean, we should be thinking about all these things and water reservoirs and other things on top of it. So, I mean, I just want to make sure you understand, I don't support doing this as a delaying tactic to addressing substantive issues that our public are concerned with. If this is to say that we need to keep looking at these issues, sure, we need to keep looking at these issues. But I don't say, if I vote for it, doesn't mean I think it should be put off to,
Senator Henson, I appreciate your comments. One of the things for me, anytime you want to introduce legislation on some of these issues, I may be a co-sponsor and a supporter, and I may not be, but I'm always working to address them, and that's
I
what
appreciate you always giving me a fair hearing. I do.
Thank you, Senator Henson. Thanks for your leadership. Are there any other discussion on the motion? All in favor, please signify by raising your right hand. It appears the vote is unanimous in favor, so I won't ask for opposed. Now, there was another motion, I think that, let's see, was it, any other motions to be made? Said recommendations from the committee. Any desire to, and I'm just going to ask. I'll withdraw that motion. We won't take it off the table. It'll die on its own at the end of the year. Said that's one of the things that happens to all good things that go away. But I do want to so much thank y'all for your participation on this committee. I think everybody in here recognizes how difficult the issues that we deal with are and the balancing that we try to do. I know that, and I want to commend Director Dunn for his work and his staff's work and what they do to try to work through these issues in EPD. It's one of those things that it is a challenge, and I really have enjoyed working with Chairman Smith as co-chairs on this committee. She got to run the mic the first couple meetings, and what I will, as the posture that we're in, I'm going to ask our staff to write up this meeting. I don't know if there's any other just so that we can, and Chairman Smith and I will want to kind of recap where we're at. But I will we'll set a teleconference time you'll get an invitation to our next meeting will be by teleconference, and we'll ratify and accept the final report that staff writes up for us. So that way we've got a good conclusion to our committee, if that's okay with all of our committee members. I think that'd be appropriate, wouldn't you, Chairman Smith?
Unless the final recommendation actually ends the meeting, it could.
Well, I've got some other things that I need to circulate, so I'm going to ask that we hold off on that. And I think we're safe, but one of the things that we get some clarification.
So have a parliamentary inquiry.
By all means, Chairman Smith.
So, for you and I to be present and to have a conference call, we have to be
We have to be together.
together, okay?
And we can do that anywhere you'd like. I've always wanted to see what LaGrange looked like.
Well, try noon and then I'll show you, so.
Pardon?
So-
Has to be a public forum that anyone can attend.
Yes, yes.
Uh-huh.
So and we can have that public forum in any location in the state.
Yes, sir. As long as people,
Yes, yes, by all means. And we'll give notice in the things there. That's
So-
no question.
So my parliamentary inquiry is, can we take up new business that involves a vote?
I would suggest we wouldn't want to.
I just want to make that clear so our members know that when we do the teleconference, it is, I think you said, a summary of what's going on, and we're not doing a surprise new issue out there that needs to be debated.
I always like to have where you get to see it in black and white as it's typed up. Anything,
So it's just reading what we've done.
yeah. I mean, that's pretty much in a nutshell where we're at.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I want to thank all the members for their attendance. I want to thank our audience for their attendance, and we stand adjourned.
Thank y'all.